So here we have our guest, Doug Powell, and he's going to speak in this video clip on proving the resurrection of Jesus with what's called the minimal facts approach. Listen to this clip. Good clip here.
But the interesting thing about that is that if you look at what biblical scholars from all sorts of traditions believe we can know about what happened to Jesus, there are certain facts that everybody agrees on. There's about 6 of them. And these are scholars, some of the most skeptical scholars still accept all of these facts. And the interesting thing is, then they try to come up with a different explanation for what happened to Jesus, and they don't account for all the facts that they accept. It's a bizarre thing. So on their own view, they still can't account for everything that they're agreeing is true. And this is actually not just evidence for the historical resurrection of Jesus, but it's a broader principle of Christianity as well, that for all unbelieving thought, it will end up being incoherent and self-refuting at some point. It can't explain the world the way it actually is and what our experience is of it. It's always going to fall down eventually at some point. It doesn't have full explanatory power, and it can't account for the assumptions that it makes. And the minimal facts is a really good way to kind of reveal that weakness that is in all unbelieving thought.
Now, I played that clip. I had already watched it, so if you're wondering all the background noise, if I didn't know about that, yes, we knew about that. But I like this clip of Doug particularly because it's obvious he's freestyling. So the guy puts a camera in his face. It looks like he's in a lunchroom with all these people talking or something, a high school cafeteria, and says, hey, talk about the minimal facts approach to prove the resurrection of Jesus. And Doug freestyles, and I think it is wonderful. With that being said, we're 3.5 minutes in already. Introducing today's guest, calling in from Nashville. We specifically want to talk about this book you've just put out called Resurrection, Eyewitness, written and designed by Doug Powell. It's a big, nice, beautiful book, maybe a coffee table book. But it's on apologetics, and it's got the pop-out pages. It's like a 3D book. It's like apologetics, resurrection, defense, come to life. They'll try to explain this book to someone who's not looking at it right now.
Well, it's kind of like if a book really wanted to be an app, but without having an iPad. It's like you said, it's a big book, so it's like 12 inches tall, and the pages are about 10 inches wide, but I treat each spread as one thing or as one chapter. And so it's like having this table of evidence in front of you as you work through the historical evidence for Jesus. And there are all sorts of things that are cut out and glued onto the pages that you have to interact with. So the information is nested, and there's a tactile element to it, and it ends up kind of guiding you through working through all the evidence. Instead of just me telling you what it is and what to think about it, you work through it. You're doing the investigation. And so, it starts out with giving a number of facts and then going through a number of theories to explain those facts. And so you get a little bit of history, and you get all sorts of other sources that people refer to. It's like you have the books there in front of you, and you get to open it up. So there's like books within books and things like that.
What made you interested in doing this topic and making a book on this?
Well, there's a graphic designer named Edward Tufte who I initially got the idea from because he has all these great ways of displaying statistical information in a graphic way, and he does these great lectures where he brings out old books by like Galileo and among some of the first books ever made, and he would show spreads from them, and there's just some things that Galileo couldn't get across any other way than by having interactions on the page. So this is a very old idea that was picked up a few years ago by a series called the Ology books. So you got like Piratology and Wizardology and things like that, and they have this same kind of nested information type of thing. But as far as I know, recently there hasn't been anything done that it tries to convey scholarly information, factual information, in this kind of way. And we live in a very highly visual society now, and one where smaller bits of information kind of made to fit into interaction seemed like a really good idea. And so found a publisher that was kind enough to let me get up to bat and see if anybody else is interested in this as well.
Well, in terms of the topic, defense of the resurrection, what you might say lends itself towards this type of presentation? I mean, I think there's, I'm probably leading you here in terms of your answer, but I think there's some really strong things to be said in reference to the resurrection that encourage us to do the kind of investigation you were just talking about.
In fact, it's interesting that that's actually how the book opens, is kind of justifying its own form as well as the content, because in 1 Corinthians 15, you see Paul actually making the case in verses 12 through 19 that if you can come up with a better story than the resurrection, then Christianity is proven wrong. And that's kind of, there's a number of interesting things about him saying that. Number one, he's pointing out the very weak spot in Christianity. So if you wanted to disprove it, this is how you would do it. And that's a unique claim in religious literature, is to point out the weak spot if you wanted to defeat it as a system. And the other thing is that if anybody ever had a conversion story that they could point to as evidence for the truthfulness of Christianity, it would be Paul. And yet that's not what he does. He's so certain of the historical, real time, space, historic event of the resurrection and the evidence for it, that's where he places the weight of his argument. And so, so he's really just challenging you to go out and investigate it. So this is what this book does. Lets you do that kind of investigation for that reason.
You want to say something? Give a sort of on-air 1-minute review of the app.
Well, the interesting thing is, I think the app is awesome, and then the book itself has its own unique this facility too. I almost would encourage people to get both. I mean, the app is, it's dirt cheap. It's $1. I mean, why wouldn't you get it if you have an iPad? And it's just awesome in terms of just being able to interact with it. And then the book has just the tactile element of it. It does feel like you're investigating it. And as we go on with the show, I'm really excited to kind of dig in a little bit more and talk about some of the great things that you've uncovered and help people uncover through those both those formats.
Doug, what would you rather people get, the app or the book or both?
It just depends on what they are able to find use, what they want to use it for. If you want to teach a Sunday school class or do some talks on it, the app is made so that you can go video out on your iPad, and then you use that instead of PowerPoint, which is great because then
all right, Doug,
kind of
check it. When we come back, we'll get into the content of the book.
But as for you, teach what accords with sound doctrine. Show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works, and in your teaching show integrity, dignity, and sound speech that cannot be condemned. With sound doctrine. With sound doctrine. With sound doctrine.
What's going on, Doug Powell? Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no doubt. So we really wanted to jump right into the content of the book. So you've sort of explained what's called the minimal facts approach, which are basically, because we played the video clip, 6 ideas that are generally have a consensus to them. And then what you do is say no hypothesis except for the biblical one, which is the true account of Jesus' resurrection, can explain the 6 facts. Doug, can you begin to take us down the road that the book does? Go.
The setup before you get to the 6 facts is why Jesus' resurrection is important to defend in the first place, because that's, in the resurrection we don't have the forgiveness of our sins. The resurrection is how we have something so fantastic that was predicted by Jesus that would happen, that if that that happened because of that prediction and all the things around it, like when he was going to be betrayed, who was going to betray him, that he was going to be betrayed, all these circumstances that he couldn't contrive, but he predicted, and most fantastically, the resurrection. If all those things came true, as verified by the resurrection, then that would give us a reason to believe the things that Jesus said that we couldn't verify, that we couldn't investigate. And there's a lot of those things, like sins are forgiven, or, there's all sorts of things that he would claim that you'd have no way to kind of fact-check him on his truthfulness. And so the resurrection gives you, if it's true, a reason to believe everything that Jesus said about himself. And so that's what makes this important. So there's only a certain few facts surrounding his death and burial that all scholars believe, whether they're believers in Christianity or not. And so it takes those 6 facts, and these scholars also try to interpret these facts in ways that come up with alternate explanations for what happened, other than the biblical claim of resurrection. And the interesting thing is that no matter what theory they come up with, it doesn't explain the 6 facts that they agree with. Only the resurrection does that. So the beauty of this argument is using only the evidence that is allowed by the very people you're trying to convince. The only way to make sense of it is still the historic resurrection.
So, Doug, we're going to get into these 6 facts in a moment, but I'm curious, these critics, the non-believers who agree with the 6 facts, what do they say to the fact that their theories don't account for the facts they accept?
You know what? I actually don't know the answer to that. They're going to vigorously defend their own theories as heavily as they can. But I've never heard anybody who is part of that has offered a theory that's being critiqued respond to this.
All right,
so I just don't know.
We'll go ahead then. Let's go ahead with getting into those facts.
Well, yeah, let's do fact 1. But I know one thing I've heard: a person, especially if they're saying naturalist, will say, well, yeah, so it may be unlikely that there was a group hallucination, for example, but isn't that more likely than a guy rising from the dead? So sometimes they'll say, well, you can say that it has less holding power, but yours is even more fantastic.
So they'll still come back to the fact that
sometimes I've heard stuff
rising
like that.
from the dead was a miracle, and perhaps they just don't want to accept
Sometimes I've heard that. So ultimately, I think it helps us show
Right.
that the real problem is unbelief, not lack of evidence.
Oh, absolutely, and I never make the claim that, and no Christian apologist, nobody making a defense should ever think that the reason somebody doesn't believe is because they lack evidence.
Right.
Because Romans 1 is very, very clear. Everyone believes, and they suppress the truth. That's what makes them guilty. So the problem isn't that they lack information. The problem is that they have it and they suppress it. Okay? So what we're doing with something like the minimal facts, what we're doing is revealing the truth, and we need to do it in love because it's revealing self-deceit. We're revealing what is being suppressed.
All right, Doug. So fact number 1 is
that Jesus was crucified. Everybody gives you that. And they also give you that he died.
All right, why is that important?
It gets important. It's important as we start looking at the alternate theories. As we get into that, we'll see that the fact that the way in which he was killed and the torture that he underwent beforehand and the verification of his death afterhand, it's like a 3-way death penalty, because the scourging, which is sometimes was sometimes referred to as the first death, very often killed people just from being scourged, from the blood loss that comes from being scourged, and any number of injuries that result from it. And then crucifixion is a guaranteed death penalty. There's only one known case in history of somebody who survived a crucifixion, and they were taken down off the cross immediately, as were 2 other people, and they still died.
So that's one fact, though, that he died by crucifixion. That's one fact as opposed to 2, correct?
That he was crucified and that he died. Those are two facts, two separate facts.
All right.
Yeah. Okay, so those are the first two, and then of course you have the spear through his heart, through his lung and his heart, which would have killed him had he not already died. Okay. So you have, and plus the whole thing's overseen by a professional executioner, so everybody's going to give you that he was crucified and that he died.
So next, Doug, you've got the empty tomb. Is that my understanding? The next one.
Then the empty tomb also entails the third fact that he was buried. So fact 3 is that he was buried. Fact 4 is that the tomb was found empty 2 days after he was buried, or on the third day after he was buried. Now the fact that he was buried is the only fact that has any detraction from it at all. There are a few very liberal scholars who will not agree that he was buried. But the reason we still count this as a fact that everybody accepts is because those scholars are not looked on very favorably within academia because they refuse to defend that view in the realm of academia. They don't write professional papers. They don't present at conferences. Instead, they make media connections and they go on the Discovery Channel and things like that. So there's never any kind of peer review, which is an important part of scholarly work. So we still accept, since the vast majority of scholars accept the burial, we still let the burial in as one of the 6 facts.
And in your book, you have biblical evidence relating to that, non-biblical evidence relating to that fact, as well as evidence from Jewish tradition. Doug, when we come back, I'd like to get into our next set of facts. I know we're having to move quick, but this is just to whet people's appetite. When we come back with Doug Powell, author of Resurrection, Eyewitness.
We are on with author, designer, musician Doug Powell. The work we're looking at is Resurrection Eyewitness, an iPad app and a book on really in a great way, great format, helping us understand what he calls the minimal facts related to the resurrection, things that almost everyone agrees on, and helps us provide a basis for why the resurrection is something that's credible. And so we've been looking through some of the different things that we mentioned, that Jesus being crucified and that he died, that he was buried, that the tomb was found empty. Those are basic facts that really pretty much everyone agrees on, that goes through all the different accounts. There's, I think, 2 more facts that we want to mention here. Doug, why don't you take us through those?
Okay, the first is that friends of Jesus believed that they saw him after his death. And when I say friends, I mean like his both the inner circle, the 12, the disciples, and also his followers. And it doesn't mean they did. Okay, that's not what the scholars are saying. It means they believe they saw him. And then the other fact is that there are some enemies of Jesus who believe they saw him as well, such as Saul of Tarsus, who, of course, became the Apostle Paul, and Jesus' own brother, James, who, when Jesus was alive, thought he was crazy. And Paul and James are pretty powerful pieces of evidence here, because Paul wouldn't have had the mindset in order to accept Christianity. In fact, he was on the way to persecute it, to round up Christians. And you have to explain why he would have shown up in Damascus with having come to faith. And it's a very hard thing to do when you take into account all the things that Paul was about. But even harder, maybe, is Jesus' own brother James. I mean, do any of you guys have brothers?
I do not have a brother.
I do not.
No one has brothers.
Ramon.
Okay, well, imagine you had a brother.
Okay,
What would it take for you to believe that your brother was God incarnate? Well, that's exactly what James came to believe, and he believed it so much that he became the leader of the church in Jerusalem and was martyred for that.
That's a fair
that's
point.
some serious belief that you've got to explain in some way. So those are the 6 facts.
One of the things, just to take off from that, one of the things that's interesting also to note, I'm looking at the page, that Friends and Enemies part of the book. You mentioned that there's different followers who believe they saw Jesus, and it is one of the things I've heard said is it's significant that women are the people who first saw Jesus. The fact that that's included in the story. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
About the women?
Yeah, I mean, I think from what I've been told, I mean, you may correct me if I'm wrong, but the fact that women were the first eyewitnesses, considering that women, if you wanted to make up a story like this, you wouldn't have picked women to be the first witnesses to the resurrected Jesus.
That's right, and that's what that gets addressed a little bit later in the book.
Okay.
Not all the evidence is thrown out there. This is at this point we've just explained the 6 facts.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But one of the things that's so important is what you brought out. And so if you're going to try to explain these 6 facts by saying, well, the apostles made this story up, they were just trying to honor Jesus, but they were making the story up, then you're going to have to explain why you were going to have women find the tomb. Because if you're going to make up a story, if you're going to invent a religion, then the person that you want to, the kinds of witnesses you want that the entire system is based on, you want them to be the best witnesses possible. Somebody like Peter or John or James, but instead you have the women. And in that particular culture at that time, women were like one step above property and considered so frivolous that either their testimony was not allowed in court, or if it was allowed in court, nobody paid attention to it. That's exactly who you wouldn't have discover the tomb if you made up the story.
For the alternate theories that you cover in this book, A Resurrection Eyewitness, we can't really discuss them too much. We might be able to discuss some on the other side of the break, but let me just run them down for the audience. The swoon theory, the wrong tomb theory, the stolen body theory, general sort of conspiracy theories or theory, legendary development, hallucination, or the twin theory, the substitution theory. There's some you don't even mention, like the theory that Jesus was an alien, but that's actually in one of your other books, Holman's quick source guide to Christian apologetics. But Doug, when we come back on the other side, let's wrap up talking about some of the content in this wonderful book, Resurrection Eyewitness.
Far out.
Sound doctrine. With sound doctrine.
We have Doug on. Thanks, Doug, for being on. We're not talking about your music, though. We're talking about your book, really on the resurrection. And we've been, the last segments, talking about 6 facts that people agree upon, even those who would not claim to be Christians, such as, 1, Jesus was crucified, that he died, that's 2, that he was buried, that there was an empty tomb, and then fact number 5 and 6 is that friends think that they saw him, and enemies think that they saw him. Now, what did that sound like?
I was trying to wait till you said the last one, and right after you said it, it was going to be like the culmination of everything, like a crescendo.
Okay.
But you didn't really quite make it.
I'm not a DJ.
I thought maybe you started another one of Doug's songs.
No, I'm a rapper. I'm not a DJ. I don't have the timing. I was trying to time it, so right when you said the last one, actually, I'm going to shift the blame. The real problem is you talk too slow. If you would have spoke faster like a normal person would, or a hip-hop person, or a younger person perhaps, then it would have been on time. But no.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. But that's what I was trying to happen there.
So, Doug, before I get cut off completely, let me ask you to go ahead with the legendary development theory. We decided we wanted to, with the time that we have, at least talk about that as something you deal with in your book.
Well, the legendary development theory is one of the ones you hear most these days, and that says that the apostles didn't concoct this story, but that it was kind of like Elvis sightings, where it kind of things got out of hand over several decades. You know, people told stories to honor Jesus and remember him, and then they get a little bit more fantastic and a little bit more fishtaily, and pretty soon he's walking on water and healing people and doing all sorts of things that weren't history. So the idea is that there's some kind of difference between the Jesus of history and the Christ of Christianity, that there's some sort of legendary development that takes place there. And interestingly enough, this only counts for 3 of the facts. Even the people who hold to this theory and agree with these 6 facts, they're not accounting for all the facts they agree with, which is one of the more baffling things about it. But there are all sorts of problems with this, because it doesn't explain things like the behavior of the disciples, how they went all over the world and got martyred for this.
Hey, Doug, can I interrupt you? Because I want to hold up right now. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hold up the book in my hands. This isn't on video, but I just want people to get a sense. This big old wonderful, beautiful book, and it's got a little sort of box on the right side of the page where the alternate theory of the legendary development is listed, and there's like a triangular shape where they're cut out in 4 quadrants, sort of in 4 different triangles of the square, and I open up flap 1, and it says, the legend theory doesn't make sense of the behavior of the disciples, and then underneath that flap is a really cool painting. I open up 2, and it's actually about, does it make sense of why the women were credited with discovering the empty tomb. I shut that one down. I open up 3, and it's got a little map of Jerusalem under the picture, and it says the legend theory doesn't make sense of resurrection being proclaimed in Jerusalem. Then I shut that one down, open up the 4th one, and it says the legend theory would have developed when apostles were still alive, and they would have corrected the false witnesses, and that is a picture of an old guy with a beard, whom I assume is the apostle. Then I shut it down and say, great job, Doug. But I wanted to do it that way, but elaborate on that, because the way you did it is really cool.
You did an excellent recap, and even though I'm on the phone and couldn't see it, it was so vivid. It was exactly right. However, that's just kind of the quick recap, because the most important piece of evidence here is the easiest way to answer this is if we actually had a document from the very first believers. Like, what did people believe the day after Jesus' resurrection? What did Christians believe? If they wrote it down right then, wouldn't it be cool to have that document? And that would settle this question. And interestingly enough, we do have a document. It's not maybe from the day after, but within a year after, and that's what the next spread in the book is about. And that deals with 1 Corinthians 15:3-7, which is one of the oldest parts in the New Testament, maybe the oldest part. And once we date Paul's conversion using different pieces of evidence we have through Scripture, we're able to see that he was converted within 1 to 5 years after the resurrection. And in 1 Corinthians 15:3-7, he says, what I received, I passed on to you. And what he received was this creed. And then he quotes this creed. So this creed predates his conversion. And so a lot of scholars now believe this is a creed that was in existence within 1 year of the resurrection, and that creed it has a very high Christology. It shows that there was no development between the historic Jesus and the Christ of Christianity, because the very first line of the creed is that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. So right there you have interpretation. You have that he's the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. You have that he is the promised Messiah. The next line is that he was buried. So now you have a real historical event. And then the third line is that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. So again, you have a historical event that could be investigated and seen, and if you were there, you could have photographed it, but you interpret it in light of the Scriptures again. And then he goes in to list a bunch of witnesses, as if you could go talk to them. And this existed before Paul was converted, which is what makes this so important, because the very thing that shoots down the most popular theory out there right now, we have it. We're really well armed to deal with those kind of objections.
Yeah, excellent recap, and I do encourage people to get that, and I love that page, The Oldest Creed. Incidentally, that's the only page, unless there's a secret compartment that I'm unaware of the whole book that doesn't have any flap out or flippy thingamajiggers on it.
You're disappointed?
Yeah, no, it's still really cool. I love the way it's a timeline thing.
But you wanted to play with something.
Yeah, or like...
Actually, you know what, Vocab, it does zoom. You just got to, like, move your head towards the page.
Oh, okay. So that's a more physical, that's a self, I don't know. Yeah, okay. Well, interesting. Now, Doug, how does what you presented, this minimal facts approach, fit into, and we only have a few minutes to talk about this, but let's try, what we might call a presuppositional framework, which is the idea that you start from the fact that you know God believes and that people know him, which you alluded to early in Romans 1. The Bible is your highest authority. Then go from there. How can you utilize this faithfully? And I would say this quickly, your video clip in the beginning hinted towards it. Lay it out a little bit more if you could.
Okay. Well, I share your view of Reformed theology, and I'm also presuppositional. But evidence is, of course, still evidence. But within the way this fits into the presuppositional view is that the way in, I'm not saying that there is any kind of neutral ground that everybody can evaluate these things from, and I'm not saying that there are tools that you can use to evaluate arguments with that were not given by God. Okay, as we think through these things logically, as we use things like the regularity of the universe and historical evidence, these things have to have a source somewhere. They come from God. Okay, so the only way in which we could evaluate the evidence is with the start point of the certainty of God to give us the tools with which we can evaluate the evidence.
But
what's interesting about that is the person who came up with the minimal facts argument is a guy named Gary Habermas. He teaches philosophy and apologetics at Liberty University. He was my professor at Biola, which is neither for Reform nor presuppositional. And he told me a great story once. He was friends with a guy named Greg Bonson, who was one of Van Til's kind of star students.
Yeah. Sorry.
And so he said that Habermas told me that when he first presented this as a paper at a professional society, that Bonson was sitting there in front of him, and Bonson, he thought he was going to get some pushback from Bonson, and they were out to dinner after he had presented this paper, and Habermas said, "All right, Greg, let me have it. Just go ahead and get it out of your system. Lay into me." And and Bonson was like, "What do you mean?" And Habermas said, "Well, go after my argument. I know you want to." And he said, "I liked it." And Habermas said, "What do you mean?" He said, and Bonson said, it was presuppositional in its form. And if you think about it, it's exactly right, because the way in which presuppositionalism works out in practicality is by assuming the unbeliever's worldview and showing how it can't make sense of itself. And that's exactly what the minimal facts argument does. And Bonson recognized that. And Bonson had a place for evidence, and this would be the kind of thing that would fit into that, where you place yourself on the view of the non-believing scholar, and you show how only the things that they agree with cannot even make sense of what they're trying to defend. And the only thing that can do it is the truthfulness of the God, the triune God of Scripture. It takes every thought captive, not just believing thought. And that's what makes this argument so powerful.
That was an awesome story, but it would have been much cooler if, during the speech, Bonson like threw a shoe at Gary's head or something like that. Kind of like at the Bush speech, anywhere he dodges it. You guys remember that?
I do.
But it's still actually a really good story. No, I'm glad we got to tell that.
Gary Habermas was a hockey coach. You do not want to mess with him.
Yeah, the Gary Habermas is awesome. I love everything about him, the beard, the voice, everything. There's only one problem, and that's that he's from Michigan. But he has some wisdom in that he's from there and doesn't live there anymore. So I do want to just make sure people hear that about Gary. But okay, so that is really enlightening, and thank you for sharing that. Now, how could people get this? How can they get some of these resources? Like, it seems obvious, but tell us, how do they track this stuff down? What are the titles? What do they need to look for to track you down on the stuff you're doing, Doug?
Well, the Resurrection Eyewitness, the book, can be had almost anywhere that you buy books, including Costco and Sam's Club and stuff like that. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, I know, Books A Million. And then the app right now is only on the App Store, so it's iPad only. It's not going to work on any Android device, but we're trying to remedy that right now.
Trying to remedy that. All right. Now, we only have a minute or so to talk about this, Doug. We touched on it briefly. How do people use this once they get it? Now, the book is kind of big. They could beat people who disagree with them in the head, but let's think of some other more wise uses about how to use these materials, the app and the book, Doug.
Well, that's for each person to figure out, given the kind of circumstance they're in. There are people who think this is excellent just for their own personal study. There are some people who are going to use it for like family worship with their kids. There are people who want to use it in order to take their small group through it or teach Sunday school classes through it. And that's one of the reasons why we made the app the way it is, so that you can use it as a presentation tool. So there's any number of ways, but probably the most important thing is just having that assurance that we are defending the truth, and that the Christian worldview takes all thought captive.
Thank you, Doug Powell, author of the book Resurrection Eyewitness. Check out the book, check out the app, check out Doug Powell. See y'all later. Hey!